Do you like to get scared when watching a movie? I know that I do, and I'm pretty sure that everyone does. I fell in love with horror movies in the sixth grade when Wes Craven released Scream. And from then on, I have spent my entire life watching nothing but horror movies and TV shows. Horror movies have been scaring us for a long time, keeping us on the edge of our seats, and they have an interesting history. Horror movies have evolved throughout the years. In the beginning, they were usually short, 5 to 15 minutes, in black and white, and were more suspenseful tales than actual horrors. Horror movies were at their height between the 60s and the 90s, where the movies were actually more realistic horror stories with violence and gore. Horror movies made today, since the start of the 2000s, are either remakes of old horror movies, extremely violent and gory, or unrealistic. The first horror movies were called spook tales, a novelty sequence designed to impress rather than tell a story. According to Mark Harris at liveabout.com, George Mills' 1896 short titled The House of the Devil is credited for being the first horror movie. The 20s were filled with silent horror films based on monsters. The 30s, sound comes into horror movies. The 50s were filled with fears of invasion, rampaging mutants, and mad scientists. Some of the movies include House of Wax in 1953, Creature from the Black Lagoon in 1954, Invasion of the Body Snatchers in 1956, The Blob in 1958, and House on Haunted Hill in 1959. The 60s was the first big decade for horror movies. Alfred Hitchcock first came onto the scene in 1960s with Psycho, and then in 1963 with The Birds. George A. Romero made his first zombie film, Night of the Living Dead, in 1968. Then we have Connor Brownfield from the Saturday Night Post states that some of the best and most violent and goriest horror movies were made in the 70s. In 1972, Wes Craven's Last House on the Left was released, followed by the shocking film The Exorcist in 1973. The very next year, in 1974, the infamous Texas Chainsaw Massacre came out. Wes Craven made The Hills Have Eyes in 1977. The biggest year for horror movies in the 70s was 1978, where John Carpenter made the first Halloween. George A. Romero made a second zombie film called Dawn of the Dead, and then I Spit on Your Grave was also released that year. The 80s was filled with Stephen King adaptation, slasher films, and The Undead. That very first year of the decade, Prom Night was released, The Shining, as well as Friday the 13th. The next year, in 1981, Sam Raimi released his zombie film titled The Evil Dead, and John Carpenter came out with Halloween 2 that same year, followed by Poltergeist in 1982. In 1984, Wes Craven made the infamous Nightmare on Elm Street. The next year, in 1985, George A. Romero released Return of the Living Dead. In 1987, Sam Raimi released the second Evil Dead. Hellraiser was also released that year. The year I was born, in 1988, a movie about a possessed murderous doll titled Chucky was released. And in that final decade of that year, Stephen King's Pet Sematary was released in 1989. The 90s was horror's best decade ever. The beginning was filled with award-winning films such as Misery in 1990, The Silence of the Lambs in 1991, and Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1992. That same year, The Candyman was released. In 1996, my absolute favorite movie, Scream, was released, which was directed by Wes Craven. That very next year, in 1997, the second film, Scream 2, was released. That same year, I Know What You Did Last Summer came out. In 1998, Blade, starring Wesley Snipes, was released, as well as Urban Legend. The last year of that decade, in 1999, the infamous Blair Witch Project was released. The first 10 years of the 2000s was a very active time for the horror genre. In 2000, Scream 3 was released. That same year, Final Destination, a film about trying to escape death, came out. Another zombie movie came out in 2002 titled 28 Days Later. That very same year, the first Resident Evil came out. There was also a very good variety of remakes made in this decade, considering the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 2003, Dawn of the Dead in 2004, Halloween in 2007, featuring Rob Zombie as the director, Prom Night in 2008, and Friday the 13th in 2009. There was also some really great original horror movies that came out in this decade, which includes Rob Zombie's House of a Thousand Corpses in 2003, the original Saw in 2004. In the following year, in 2005, Rob Zombie's The Devil Reject was released. The first Hostel was also released that year. The Creepy Tale of the Strangers came out in 2008, and in 2009, the original Paranormal Activity was released. After 2010, the movie studios didn't release as many horror films as they have in the previous decades. In 2010, the remake of I Spit on Your Grave was released. In 2011, Scream 4 came out. Sinister, the quite unique horror story, came out in 2012. In 2013, the first Purge was released. That same year, the remake of The Evil Dead and Texas Chainsaw was released. Eli Roth's extremely intense The Green Inferno was released in 2013. In 2016, Don't Breathe was put into theaters. In 2017, the It remake came out, as well as Happy Death Day. Another installment of Halloween came out in 2018, as well as The Strangers Pray at Night and Slender Man. In 2019, Rob Zombie's 3 from Hell, The Prodigy, and Happy Death Day to You was released. Finally, in 2022, the last film in my favorite series so far came out, entitled Scream. It is remarkably interesting to just see how horror movies have evolved in the last 131 years. You should now see the evolution of the horror film genre, where it started, and how each decade made their own unique spin on horror movies. John Carpenter said it best: the horror genre never dies. It just keeps getting reinvented, and it always will. Horror is a universal language. We're all afraid. We're born afraid, and we're all afraid of things such as death, disfigurement, and loss of a loved one. Everything that I'm afraid of, you're afraid of, and vice versa. So everybody feels fear and suspense. Thank you.